Backstage at a concert hall in Berlin, a 60-year-old rock singer presses his palm flat against his chest, trying to steady a heartbeat that will not slow down. Beyond the curtain, he can hear something that still does not feel real. 100 classical musicians tuning their instruments, bows sliding across strings in that shimmering, dissonant hum before a performance begins. In a few minutes, Klaus Meine of Scorpions is going to walk out under those lights and sing hard rock anthems in front of the full Berlin Philharmonic. It is the year 2000. Grunge has already buried the kind of music Scorpions spent 3 decades building. Radio has moved on without them. MTV barely remembers their name. And tonight, standing in front of violinists and cellists who have spent their entire lives mastering Beethoven and Brahms, this German rock band is about to gamble everything on one impossible, terrifying question. Can a hurricane share a stage with an orchestra? Or is this the night that finally proves every critic who wrote Scorpions off was right all along? To understand why this single night carried so much weight, you have to go back to the band Scorpions used to be. Formed in Hanover in the late 1960s by Rudolf Schenker and carried through the 70s and 80s by Klaus Meine's soaring, unmistakable voice and Matthias Jabs's blistering guitar, Scorpions became one of the biggest hard rock exports Germany had ever produced. By 1984, Rock You Like a Hurricane was blasting out of car radios all across America, turning a band from Hanover into arena headliners on another continent. By 1990, Wind of Change had become something far bigger than a song. It was the sound of the Berlin Wall coming down, a gentle, whistled melody that seemed to carry an entire generation's hope across a crumbling Cold War border, played on radios in cities that had been enemies for decades. Scorpions were not just a band anymore. They were a symbol of something enormous. Arenas from Tokyo to Los Angeles sold out within hours. Their leather jackets, their pyrotechnics, their choruses built to be screamed back by 50,000 voices at once, all of it defined an era of rock stardom that, from the inside, felt like it could never end. But music does not stand still, and neither does fashion. And by the early 1990s, almost everything Scorpions represented had suddenly become unfashionable. A band called Nirvana released an album called Nevermind, and seemingly overnight, the polished, larger-than-life sound of 80s hard rock started to feel like a costume nobody wanted to be caught wearing anymore. Flannel replaced spandex. Raw, wounded, unpolished vocals replaced soaring stadium choruses. Grunge did not simply compete with bands like Scorpions. It seemed determined to erase the entire glossy world they came from, chord by chord. Through the 90s, Scorpions kept releasing albums, kept touring, kept quietly reinventing their sound. But the radio stations that once fought over their singles had moved on to other names. Their 1999 album, Eye to Eye, leaned hard into electronic production, chasing a kind of relevance that never quite arrived. And fans and critics alike were unkind about it. Whispers started circulating inside the industry, the kind of whispers no band ever wants to hear. Maybe Scorpions had said everything they had left to say. Maybe it was finally time to accept that their moment, the one that once felt endless, had quietly passed them by. It was in the middle of that uncertainty that Klaus Meine had an idea that sounded to some people around him almost reckless. Meine had always heard something classical hiding just underneath Scorpion's music, buried in plain sight for 30 years. The soaring melodies, the dramatic key changes, the way Wind of Change swelled and ached like a symphony, even played with nothing but guitars and drums. He began to wonder, quietly at first, what would happen if that hidden orchestral heart was finally let loose, fully, honestly, with a real orchestra standing behind it instead of hinting at one. Not a synthesizer pretending to be strings the way so many rock records had faked it before. Not a sample. The real thing. Bows and rosin and 100 years of tradition. Rudolf Schenker, the band's founder and rhythm guitarist, listened to Meine's idea and felt something caught between excitement and dread. Hard rock bands did not go near orchestras, not seriously, not without being accused of selling out, or worse, of trying far too hard to seem important. And yet, the more the two of them talked it through, the more it felt like the only bold move left on the table. If commercial relevance was already slipping through their fingers anyway, why not risk everything on something honest instead? Why not finally attempt the one thing critics swore a band like theirs could never pull off?
Turning that idea into reality meant finding someone who could stand between two completely different musical worlds and convince each one to trust the other. That person was Austrian conductor and composer Christian Kolonowitz, a man deeply respected in classical circles who also, unusually, understood the raw, emotional language of rock and roll. When Scorpions first approached him with the concept, even Kolonowitz needed a long moment to process what they were actually asking. A rock band wanted to rework songs like Send Me an Angel and Still Loving You with a full symphony orchestra, and not as a gimmick, not as a novelty encore, but as a serious, fully realized artistic statement. Word spread inside the classical world quickly, and not everyone reacted kindly. Some musicians rolled their eyes at the idea of orchestral players lending their instruments and their reputations to a band best known for leather pants, smoke machines, and pyrotechnics. There was a real, quiet fear inside the Scorpions camp that this whole collaboration could collapse into a punchline instead of a triumph. A desperate publicity stunt wearing the costume of reinvention. Kolonowitz believed otherwise, and that belief mattered more than anyone expected. He heard exactly what Meine heard. Underneath the distortion, these were genuinely dramatic, emotionally rich compositions, songs that had earned the right to be treated with real orchestral weight. He agreed to take on the challenge, and the real work, the terrifying, unglamorous work of actually building this thing note by note, finally began. The first rehearsals were, by every account, deeply awkward. Picture a room where classically trained musicians, people who read every note on the page with surgical precision, suddenly found themselves sitting across from rock musicians who built entire songs out of feel, instinct, and raw volume. Matthias Jabs, a guitarist used to bending a single string until it screamed with feeling, now had to find a way to let that scream breathe alongside a string section trained for discipline and restraint. There were long, uncomfortable silences in those early sessions, moments where nobody quite knew how to bridge the gap between two languages that had never really spoken to each other before. Some orchestra members privately doubted whether rock power chords could ever coexist honestly
with a full symphonic arrangement, without simply drowning it out entirely. Klaus Meine remembered feeling like an outsider, walking into a world with its own strict, unspoken rules. A world where his instincts as a rock frontman suddenly felt too loud, too big, too undisciplined for the room he was standing in. But slowly, patiently, something began to shift. A cellist would linger a fraction longer on a note, echoing the ache already sitting in Mine's voice.
A violin line would swell exactly where a guitar solo once tore through the same song, and suddenly the two worlds were not fighting each other anymore. They were finishing each other's sentences. Kalanovich kept pushing both sides toward one another, refusing to let the orchestra simply decorate the rock songs from a polite distance, insisting instead that they become true co-authors of the arrangement, equal partners inside the same emotional story. As the sessions deepened, another unexpected name entered the picture: Jim Steinman, the legendary American songwriter and producer behind some of the most theatrical, larger-than-life rock ballads ever committed to tape. Steinman understood grand, sweeping emotional gestures better than almost anyone alive, and he became a genuine creative partner on brand-new material written specifically for this project, including the album's title track, Moment of Glory. Working with Steinman pushed the band even further from safe, familiar territory. This was never going to be a simple covers album, dressed up with a few added strings for effect. It was going to include entirely new songs built from the ground up to live comfortably inside this orchestral world. Songs that demanded the same operatic scale as the classical reworkings surrounding them. For a band that had spent 30 years writing verses and choruses engineered for stadiums packed with 50,000 people, suddenly writing for cellos, French horns, timpani, and a 100-piece ensemble was an entirely new kind of vulnerability. Every one of them felt it, in rehearsal rooms that suddenly felt much quieter, much more exposed than any arena ever had. Then came the night everything had been building toward. That summer evening at Berlin's Waldbühne, an open-air amphitheater carved into the forest on the edge of the city. A stone stage with decades of complicated history pressed into its walls. Thousands of fans filed into the seats as the sky over the trees slowly turned from gold to deep blue. Backstage, band members who had headlined stadiums for 20 years found their hands unsteady in a way none of them wanted to admit out loud. Klaus Meine walked toward the stage entrance to find not a wall of amplifiers waiting behind him, but rows of violins catching the last of the evening light, bows raised, poised, ready. When the first swelling notes of the orchestra rose up underneath the opening song, an audible gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound of pure disbelief passing from row to row, from people who had shown up expecting a familiar Scorpions concert and instead found themselves witnessing something none of them yet had the words for. Meine later admitted his hands were shaking as he lifted the microphone to his mouth. This was the moment. Either the gamble paid off in front of thousands of witnesses, or Scorpions became the cautionary tale everyone in the industry had quietly been predicting for years. It paid off. As Send Me an Angel swelled with real strings instead of synthesizers, longtime fans scattered across the Waldbühne wept openly, overwhelmed by hearing a song they thought they already knew by heart, completely transformed into something achingly, almost unbearably beautiful. Voices that had shouted along to this same chorus for a decade suddenly went quiet, listening instead.
When the orchestra thundered in behind "Rock You Like a Hurricane," it did not feel like compromise, and it did not feel like surrender to some older, more respectable art form. It felt like the song had finally grown into its true size, as if it had been waiting 15 years for enough instruments in the room to match its own ambition. Matthias Jabs traded phrases with the concertmaster's violin the way he once traded them with a second guitarist, and the crowd roared at every exchange like they were watching a duel. Rudolf Schenker stood near the front of the stage, rhythm guitar in hand, grinning at musicians in formal black who, only weeks earlier, had barely looked him in the eye. Critics who attended that night, many of them arriving prepared to mock the entire spectacle as a desperate stunt, found themselves instead quietly reconsidering everything they thought they understood about where the boundaries of rock music were actually supposed to sit. By the time the final notes rang out into the Berlin night, the ovation did not sound like polite applause. It sounded like relief.
Moment of Glory, released later that year, did not turn Scorpions back into the arena-dominating force they had been in 1990, and it did not silence the industry whispers overnight. But that was never really the point, and everyone involved seemed to sense it at the time. What the album did was something rarer and, in its own way, more valuable. It proved that a band written off as a relic of a dead era could still take a genuine artistic risk in front of the whole world, could still surprise people who thought they had nothing left to be surprised by, and could still stand shoulder to shoulder with one of the most respected orchestras on the planet and hold their own without flinching. It opened a door that other major rock acts would later walk through, embracing orchestral reinventions of their own catalogs in the years that followed. But Scorpions had gotten there first, driven not by trend chasing or calculation, but by something closer to desperation and faith fused together into one last defiant swing. Decades later, Moment of Glory is remembered not as a footnote in the Scorpions' story, but as one of its boldest, most unlikely chapters, proof that reinvention does not always mean chasing whatever happens to be fashionable in a given decade. Sometimes it means trusting that the emotional truth buried inside your music was always bigger than the genre anyone ever tried to trap it in. Klaus Meine, Rudolf Schenker, and Matthias Jabs did not know, walking into that first awkward rehearsal, whether 100 classical musicians would ever truly meet them halfway. They only knew that standing still, playing it safe, chasing whatever sound happened to be popular that year, had already stopped working. So they chose the harder, riskier road instead, the one that could have humiliated them in front of the entire music world. And on that stage at the Waldbühne, with an orchestra rising up behind him and thousands of voices roaring back, Klaus Meine finally got his answer, backstage nerves and all. The hurricane and the orchestra were never enemies. They had simply been waiting all along for someone brave enough to put them in the same room.